All right. Thank you very much, Volker, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today and sharing my joint work together with Kinshuk Jarrett from Columbia Business School. So we are presenting a new project where we were interested in consumers' perceived privacy violations in online advertising. And essentially, our research is set up in the context of the recent discussions around consumer privacy in online advertising. So consumers are concerned about their privacy with regard to advertising. Why? Because advertisers are increasingly tracking users. They store the data of users and collect the data. They build profiles and they target users based on these profiles. And consumers have increasingly stated that they perceive their privacy to be violated by these actions. The regulators have responded to these privacy concerns on advertising. So we've seen a rise in privacy regulation, for example, the European Union with the GDPR. The United States have responded with the CCPA in California, but there are also state-level privacy laws. There's even a discussion about national privacy law in the United States, and we also see similar laws in Brazil, which are somewhat different, but most of all, they want to give users more control about their data and better protect their data. And of course, also the industry is adapting to practices. We have Apple introducing ATT, for example. Google is thinking about cookie deprecation. There's a discussion there this year. If you followed it, Google wants to give users control, and basically users should decide whether to accept or reject cookies. And what we also see is that the industry is investing into so-called privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs for short. These privacy-enhancing technologies in online advertising set out to kind of, on the one hand side, better protect consumer privacy, to adapt to these strict privacy laws, and at the same time maintaining the utility of the data and still allow targeting and advertising effectiveness and ad measurement. So ad targeting and ad measurement, while doing that at a privacy-preserving way. There are two prominent examples of PETs in the online advertising industry, which are publicly available under the Google Privacy Sandbox. One initiative is the so-called Google Topics initiatives. There, the main feature is that the data stays on the local machine, so it stays on your mobile phone or your local desktop computer, and would only allow group-level profiling. So Google would be placing you in a group of people interested in soccer, for example, and then target you in a group of people interested in soccer, and you could hide in this group of other people that are interested in soccer, and therefore this would be more privacy preserving than individual level targeting, but you're still targeted under this initiative. And there's also an initiative called the Protected Audience Initiative. There again, your data is better protected, so it stays on your local machine, but Google would still be targeting you at the individual level and send you ads based on the profile that is also generated at the individual level. So these are two proposals that we see in the market, Google Topics and the Protected Audience initiative. And these PETs are examples of other PETs that the industry is proposing. From a technical perspective or an engineering point of view, these seem like good solutions. So Google is pushing them very hard. They objectively better protect the consumer's privacy because the data is not leaving your local machine, but people are still seeing targeted ads. Recent research by Johnson and Neumann shows that of the 60,000 top commercial websites, 40% already adopted one of those initiatives of the Google Privacy Sandbox. So this is a rising topic in the industry. But what about the consumers? So this is a little bit less clear. How do consumers respond to this? Do they feel better privacy protected? This is what we are trying to answer in this research project. So to what extent do consumers perceive their privacy being violated under different privacy proposals that we're seeing and the current industry status quo? So we are specifically looking at pets, which Google is proposing. So these are a technical improvement of consumer privacy as the data stays on the user's machine, but the user still receives targeted advertising either at the individual level under the Protected Audience Initiative or at the group level under the Topics Initiative. So what are consumers' perceptions of these privacy-enhancing technologies? And can we use a theory to think about these consumer perceptions? Can we derive predictions and then test these predictions using data from consumers? That's the idea of this paper. So what we do is we use the dual privacy theory. I'll talk more about this theory in a minute, which postulates that consumers have intrinsic and instrumental privacy preferences for privacy. And we use this theory to understand consumers' perceived privacy violations under different practices in the online advertising industry. So let me get a little bit deeper into our theory and predictions. So essentially what we're trying to do in the paper is we are looking at different firm practices in online advertising, and we consider how these practices differ with regard to the tracking and targeting consumers. So all the way at the bottom here, you can see the current industry status quo, which is behavioral targeting. And here, users are tracked at the individual level and the data leaves their local machine. So the data leaves their smartphone, for example, and people are targeted at the individual level based on their past usage behavior on the focal website, but also other websites and apps that the user has been visiting. Then one industry proposal that I introduced in the beginning of the talk is Google's Protected Audience Initiative. So this is basically individual level targeting pet. So there, the main difference is that you're still tracked at the individual level, but the data stays on the local machine. In terms of targeting, you would still be getting individual level targeting based on your behavior. So there's no difference to the industry status quo at the moment. Another proposal by Google, sorry, I clicked too far, is the group level targeting, which is accomplished under Google Topics. Here again, in terms of tracking, you're tracked at the individual level, but your data stays on the user's machine. So there's some additional level of privacy protection. And additionally, in terms of targeting, so the ads that you receive, you would be targeted at a group level. So again, there is this additional privacy protection layer that allows you to hide in a group and not reveal or not get individually targeted at the personal level. Then other proposals or other practices are contextual targeting. Here, in terms of tracking, the focal website would only determine whether you're present or not at a specific website, but they would not be using your past data from profiling and browsing. And the targeting is also carried out at the individual level based on the context that you're visiting. So we're here we're not tracking any behavior offsite, and we're not using any behavior offsite for targeting. So in that sense, contextual targeting would be more privacy preserving than the other practices, D, E, and F that I mentioned before. Of course, we could also think of a world with untargeted ads. So there's no tracking and no targeting under those conditions. And of course, there could also be a theoretical case where we see no ads and no tracking. So these are the conditions that we're later on testing in our experiment. And for each of those conditions, we're using the dual privacy theory to derive predictions on the potential privacy violations that consumers perceive under these conditions. So let me get a little bit more into the theory. So the dual privacy theory has been proposed by a Chicago economist, Becker, 1980, and has been further developed by Lin in her Marketing Science Job Market paper, 2022, but also echoed in other work, for example, by Choi and other authors, 2023. The basic idea of the dual privacy theory is that privacy preferences have two components, an intrinsic component and an instrumental component. The intrinsic component is essentially a consumer's inherent taste for privacy, and this arises from a consumer's desire to have control over one's personal information. And this is also echoed, for example, in the GDPR. So there, the legislation mainly focuses on this idea of giving users control and addresses this intrinsic component. So is the data known or not known, essentially? And the second component is the instrumental component. And this component refers to the firm's usage of consumers' data. So it refers to this trade-off of costs and benefits of sharing personal data with the firm. So users may have benefits from sharing personal data, for example, by getting targeted content or getting targeted advertising with targeted information. So there's less nuisance, but there is also costs, of course, of sharing the data with the firm. And overall, this component refers to the economic consequences of revealing personal information to the firm from the user's perspective. In general, this component is seen as net negative. Of course, it can vary at the individual level. There are some arguments why the instrumental component can be seen as net negative. For example, there's survey evidence that shows that 81% of the public said that the potential risks they face because of data collection by companies outweigh the benefits. There's also recent academic research by Mustri and co-authors who argue that if the search costs are sufficiently low, consumers are generally aware of product categories that interest them. Behaviorally targeted ads are unlikely to improve surplus. And there's also a report by the European Commission that notes that the costs of behavioral targeting outweigh the benefits, and they call for a reform of the current advertising model. So what we do next is basically we use these two components, the intrinsic component and the instrumental component, and we apply those to the different regimes or to the different practices of online advertising and try to derive expectations on how the intrinsic and instrumental disutility is violated by those different practices in online advertising. So this is what we do in this chart. So we basically add two columns or append two columns to the right of the chart that you already know. And if you look all the way in the back, I don't know, can you see my pointer here? You can see that we get the laser pointer here. You can see here for behavioral targeting, you can see that with regard to perceived intrinsic disutility, this should be high. Why? Because the data is actually leaving your local machine. So this is the current industry status quo, but also the perceived instrumental disutility, so how the firm is using the data, should also be high. Why? Because we are facing here individual level targeting based on the user's past browsing behavior. So this is all relatively speaking, and relatively speaking, this would be the most privacy invasive usage and tracking of data, and therefore behavioral targeting would be scoring high on the perceived intrinsic disutility and on the instrumental disutility. Then when we look at the PATs, Google protected audiences. So here you're still tracked at the individual level, but your data stays on the machine. So in that sense, intrinsic disutility would be low. There's more privacy protection. So the data stays with the customer. Only the information of a segment level membership is passed on to target you then at the individual level, which means that the data is using, the firm is using your data at the individual level based on past target browsing behavior. And this again should lead to high instrumental disutility of the consumer. Then we can look at the other proposal, the group level targeting, Google Topics initiative. There again, in terms of tracking, we have individual level tracking, data stays on the machine. Again, intrinsic disutility should be low. And instrumental disutility should also be low. Why? Because we have this feature of group level targeting. So this should be more privacy preserving than, for example, individual level targeting, which we had under Protected Audience Initiative and behavioral targeting. Contextual targeting, we expect to be low on both conditions because there's no tracking and profiling. You are only tracked in the sense that the focal publisher determines whether you are at the respective website or not. And in terms of usage of the data, which refers to the instrumental disutility, we're only targeting you at the individual level, but only based on the context. And then for the other two conditions, we essentially expect for untargeted ads regarding the perceived intrinsic disutility to be 0. There's no tracking, so there's no data leaving the consumer in that sense. And the same for no ads, no tracking. The only difference between the last two conditions, A and B, is essentially that the user is not being tracked, but under B, the user receives ads. So the perceived instrumental disutility depends in the end on the perception of advertising, which of course can be -0 or positive, depending on whether you perceive ads as beneficial or not beneficial, or you're kind of indifferent. So these are our predictions for the different experimental conditions. And we expect consumer perceived privacy violation to weakly increase from the conditions A to F. And this is what we're going to test in our experiments that we ran with consumers in the United States. So where does this come from, and where did we get some inspiration for the experiments? So essentially, we went back to the seminal work of Kahneman. They were actually interested in fairness and entitlement in the market. So if you remember this paper, what they basically did is they exposed consumers to different scenarios of price changes and different reasons for price changes, and then essentially measured whether these practices by the firm were perceived as completely fair or very unfair. So they also used a single item measure to determine fairness perceptions of consumers. And this work actually has been recently echoed also in the marketing literature. So there's some work from Olivier Toubia and co-author on pricing fairness under the pandemic. And there also price fairness was measured using a single item measure. Do you perceive firm practices completely unfair to completely fair on a scale from 1 to 9? So we use that similar idea to measure consumers' perceived privacy perceptions. So what we do in the study is we essentially ran an online study in the United States with about 1,700 consumers. We had a between subjects design. We then randomized people into 7 treatment groups. Each of those groups describes one advertising practice. And we also conducted 3 follow-up studies in 2023, so 2 in the US and 1 in Europe, which essentially led to a sample size of about 5,000 users, and the results are statistically identical. So I'm only going to show you the results of the main study, but in the paper we also show you the results of the other studies, which are essentially identical in terms of the results. And we use this idea of determining consumer privacy perceptions by using a single item measure of perceived privacy violation, PPV, which basically asks consumers, based on the scenario above, do you perceive your privacy to be violated, measured on a scale from 1, not at all, to 7, very much so. So that's kind of the idea, what we did in our study. Here you can see the timing and of the studies and the salience of information on the Google Privacy Sandbox. So to generate this graph, we used Google Trends, and which shows us that generally information on the Google Privacy Sandbox in 2023 is increasing. You can see our first studies here in February, and then we did another one in September and one in November. So after more information on the Google Privacy Sandbox was available. This is interesting because it shows that theoretically consumers could have learned more about the Google Privacy Sandbox and the pet proposals. But interestingly, our PPV measure did not move over time, so we cannot really find evidence for consumer learning over time in our data, as the results of experiments were statistically similar for all the conditions. So here are some examples for the stimuli. So what we did is we tried to describe those conditions very neutral. We also didn't mention the name Google, for example, so we wanted to avoid those brand effects. On top, you can see the description for untargeted ads, below the description for contextual ads. the first part basically says your online activity will not be tracked, your data will not leave your device, and you will not be identifiable on the internet. This description is the same under contextual ads. The difference comes in with regard to the description of ads. Under untargeted ads, we said you will not be targeted based on any past or current activity. And under contextual ads, basically, we said you're targeted only based on the context, and you're not going to be targeted based on your past browsing history, so you're not based on the websites that you have visited in the past. So this gives you a flavor of what we asked from the consumers, and based on this description, we then wanted to know whether consumers feel their privacy to be violated, not at all or very much so. Here's also more examples of the group level targeting PET and the individual level targeting PET. So essentially, we again told people that their online activity is tracked, and the data that can identify you or your devices will never leave your device. So this is this idea of enhanced privacy protection under Google Topics and Google Protected Audience. The only difference is, again, only the targeting mechanism. So Google Topics uses this idea of group level targeting, and we explained this in simple language. So you're basically assigned in groups of people with similar interests that have visited similar websites than you in the past, and then you're targeted based on this information and your group membership, and you will not be identifiable individually, versus under the individual level targeting, basically targeting works as we're used to under behavioral targeting. So you will receive targeted ads at the individual level based on the websites that you have been visiting in the past. So that's kind of the idea what we did in the experiments. Then we asked people, do you perceive your privacy to be violated or not? Let's have a look at the results. You maybe have been waiting for this. So first of all, as expected, perceived privacy violation is the lowest when there is no tracking. So under conditions A and B, and it's statistically the same, irrespective of whether ads are shown are not shown under condition A or shown under condition B. So people don't necessarily dislike seeing ads. They dislike tracking. That's what we're seeing here based on our results. A second finding that we can make is if a consumer is being tracked, so this is the condition C, D, E, and F, then perceived privacy violation is statistically significantly higher than when a consumer is not being tracked. The third interesting finding is that among the conditions in which a consumer is being tracked, perceived privacy violation is the lowest for contextual ads. So these are the conditions C that we see here. Where tracking simply means that we're using data on the focal website. So we're detecting that you're here at the focal website and we're targeting you based on this information. And then if there is individual level tracking of activity, so this is conditions D, E, and F, perceived privacy violation is again statistically significantly higher than under the conditions C1 and C2. And among the conditions D, E, F, perceived privacy violation is lower and statistically the same for conditions D and E, in which data doesn't leave the machine. And what is interesting here is that at the same time, the distinction between profiling and targeting at the group or at the individual level doesn't matter for our PPV measure. And finally, perceived privacy violation is the highest for condition F. So this is the current industry status quo, which corresponds to the status quo of behavioral targeting, where we do individual level tracking, profiling, and targeting with data leaving the local machine. So these are the numbers. We also summarized this in a nice picture. So in summary, our results show that if online advertisers are not tracking a consumer, perceived privacy violation is low, which you can see here under no ads, no tracking, and untargeted ads. If we do increased tracking and targeting and data leaving the machine, that contributes to a larger perceived privacy violation. Industry proposals, such as the Google Privacy Sandbox, which are basically those pets I was talking about, which state that the data should never leave the consumer's machine, compared to the current industry status quo, help somewhat. So this is what you can see here. So data not leaving the machine leads to some improvement relative to the industry status quo, but it's not a very large improvement. Interestingly, the distinction that Google is making between individual level targeting, group level targeting doesn't play a role here. So what really is driving this difference is the data not leaving the machine, but there's no difference between individual and group level targeting. What makes the difference is then contextual targeting. And what is also interesting based on our results is that people seem to be indifferent between untargeted ads and no tracking. What really makes the difference is actually the tracking part. So people don't necessarily dislike online advertising. So what we also do is to show that our theory is actually useful in predicting perceived privacy violation is we plot the results of our study on those two dimensions. So we have the intrinsic disutility, so the first component of the dual privacy theory. On the y-axis, we have the instrumental disutility. On the x-axis, and essentially if intrinsic disutility or instrumental disutility or both are increasing, you can also see that perceived privacy violation is weakly increasing, which kind of gives additional or gives us additional confidence that consumers are actually thinking along those two dimensions when deriving their privacy preferences, and gives some justification for using this theory in our research. We also run descriptive regressions to better understand the relationship between intrinsic and instrumental disutility and perceived privacy violation. So what we do here is we pool all the results from our US studies, 5,000 subjects, and we find that the levels of intrinsic disutility as well as the levels of instrumental disutility are positively and highly statistically significantly correlated with consumers' privacy violation. For higher levels of intrinsic disutility and instrumental disutility, we find a higher or a stronger positive relationship with perceived privacy violation and vice versa. So these findings give us additional confidence in our theoretical predictions. And finally, what we also did in our research is we asked respondents in one study why they provided a specific PPV score and asked them to give textual answers. And we used those answers in a LDA analysis. And we identified two distinct topics representing intrinsic and instrumental disutility in line with our theoretical predictions. So in the intrinsic disutility, we find, for example, keywords such as device, violation, leaving the device, so in line with the intrinsic dimension of privacy preferences, basically the data getting known or not being known, or not being protected. And the instrumental disutility there, the keywords refer to more what the firm is doing with the data. So it refers to tracking, targeting, advertising. And it seems to be that this result gives us some additional face validity that consumers are actually thinking along those two dimensions when deriving their privacy violations. We also see that these two topics are distinct from each other on our multidimensional map and capture basically the whole corpus of words or answers that we received from the consumers. So these are our main findings. We also were thinking about some extensions. So first of all, one question that you may be wondering about could be that this is kind of constructed on the spot so that the context that we are providing in our study may have an impact on the PPV, the perceived privacy violation measure. This could be the case. So what we do is essentially we ask people in very plain and English way about their privacy violation. And then what we did is we essentially consider the main study or the main explanation of group level targeting in this example as low information treatment. And then what we did is we provide in this additional study, we provide more information on describing group level targeting, which is actually derived how Google describes Google topics without mentioning the brand name Google. So this is exactly what Google has on their website, and we consider this the high information treatment. So what we're doing is basically we're contrasting those two treatments, the high information treatment and the low information treatment, and want to figure out whether that can change perceived privacy violations. So what we see here is that in experimental condition D1, which is essentially replicating our main finding, so this is the low information condition, there we don't get a statistically different result. And what we see is that more information actually helps. So the more information or high information scenario is actually reducing perceived privacy violation. But interestingly, it's not changing the rank order of our different experimental conditions or the different practices in online advertising. So we can replicate our main findings. We find lower PPV for the high information treatment, but perceived privacy violation for group level targeting is still significantly larger than contextual targeting, and the rank order of online advertising practices that we established in the main experiment remains intact. So there's no shift or it doesn't change our results when we are providing more information under group level targeting. A second question that you could be thinking about is, does directly asking for intrinsic and instrumental privacy preferences change perceived privacy violation? So what we did here, we wanted to understand, again, whether consumers are actually thinking along those lines of intrinsic and instrumental privacy preferences when thinking about those two conditions. And what we did is we ask people to conduct a paired comparison of our experimental groups. So we would use the same conditions as in our main experiments, but we would present them to consumers in pairs. So you would see condition A and condition C1. So condition A is no ads, no tracking. Condition C1 is contextual targeting side by side. And then we would ask you two questions regarding your intrinsic and instrumental privacy preferences. So the first question basically refers to which scenario presented above do you perceive to cause a greater violation of your privacy due to sharing of your personal information. So this refers to the intrinsic component of privacy violations, so data being known or not known by the firm. And the second question refers to the instrumental component, which is essentially which scenario presented above do you perceive to cause a greater violation of your privacy due to the usage of your information by online advertisers. So this refers to the instrumental component of privacy. And then we asked users or consumers to make the paired comparison. So I see a greater privacy violation in scenario 1. There's no difference between the two scenarios, or there's a greater violation of scenario 2. So what do we find here? So this is again, the two conditions that I showed you before. So we have two scenarios, condition A, no ads, no tracking, and contextual targeting. And then what we see here in terms of the results, is that in terms of the intrinsic privacy preferences, majority of people sees a greater violation in contextual targeting over no ads, no tracking, and a greater instrumental privacy violation also in terms of contextual targeting versus no ads, no tracking. So this is kind of what we would be expecting. Similar results for when we compare no ads, no tracking to individual level targeting, and also the same thing for behavioral targeting versus no ads, no tracking, and similarly for the other conditions. So this is all in line with our main experiment. Again, it gives us some additional confidence that consumers are actually thinking along the lines of intrinsic and instrumental privacy preferences when making their judgments about their perceived privacy violations when they are exposed to those conditions. All right, to sum up and derive some implications. So what we did in this research, we asked consumers about their privacy violations under different practices in online advertising. And these practices differ in their terms of tracking and targeting. So we looked at the industry status quo of behavioral targeting to recent privacy proposals to contextual targeting or a world where we have untargeted ads or no ads at all. We found that pets, such as the Google Privacy Sandbox, they lower perceived privacy violation relative to the current industry status quo, but the decrease is actually quite small. Perceived privacy violation is reduced if data never leaves the consumer's machine, but it doesn't make a difference, at least in the eyes of the consumers, whether there is group level or individual level targeting. So there we didn't find a statistical difference. It didn't matter that much to the consumers, but data not leaving the consumer's machine, which speaks to this intrinsic privacy preference, actually helped. What really reduces consumers' privacy perceptions is contextual targeting, and without tracking, consumers are actually indifferent between seeing untargeted ads and no ads, which leads us to the conclusion that consumers are not necessarily worrying about advertising, but they are more worried about the tracking practices in the industry. What does this mean? So what are our contributions and implications? So we contribute with this work to the recent discussions around online privacy in the industry, and want to give implications for industry players, policymakers, and consumers. What is also interesting that the dual privacy theory seems to be actually useful in deriving expectations about privacy violations in the context of online advertising. But we believe that this theory may also be useful in other contexts when it comes to data practices. So you could think of, for example, census data or more sensitive data like genetic data, for example. So we could also use this theory in other contexts. And it seems promising based on our results that we can derive predictions how consumers will think about their privacy in those contexts. And what we also saw that pets that technically improve privacy may not necessarily improve perceptions of privacy if consumers perceive that targeting is still specific enough. So we need initiatives to enhance perceived privacy as well as technical privacy to educate consumers. And what we also saw from our data is that the information that is available in the market now doesn't seem to be sufficient. So there was more information becoming available in the market on the privacy sandbox, but it didn't change consumers' privacy perceptions. So we may have to think about like what would be the right type of ways to educate consumers on this topic. And what is maybe also interesting with regard to privacy regulation is that most of the regulation so far addresses this intrinsic component of privacy violation, but it's relatively silent on the instrumental component. So how firms are using the data or the inferences that are making that firms are making from the data. So the legislations are relatively silent on this, and I think this could also be a direction for future regulation to think more not only about data storage and control, but also what is done with the data in the end of the day. So this is it for today. Thank you very much for your attention. And as Volker mentioned at the beginning, the paper is also available on SSRN. So if you like to download the paper, read more about it, check it out. And we would look forward to any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you very much.